The war in Ukraine rages on with yet more haunting stories and images emerging by the day. But here, are we only beginning to feel the shockwaves from Europe's most far-reaching conflict in decades? Welcome to The View. Tonight, it's St Patrick's Day, and for the first time in 2 years, Washington has opened its doors to everyone with Irish links. Our political editor, Enda McClafferty, is there.
Yes, the festivities are almost over here in Washington, but for the second year in a row, it has been a virtual St Patrick's Day for the Taoiseach after he was forced to self-isolate after testing positive for COVID. I'll have all the details very shortly.
At home, fuel prices are soaring, supply chains are stretched, and agri-food producers are under real financial pressure. We'll ask the Agriculture Minister how he plans to keep farmers solvent and supermarket shelves stocked. And as the refugee crisis caused by the war in Ukraine grows, we'll ask a human rights lawyer what people here can do to help. Hello. A further step to normality following the pandemic as the great and the good gather once again in Washington for the St Patrick's Day celebrations, and among them is our political editor, Enda McClafferty. Enda, welcome to you. It might be St Patrick's Day with the most Irish of presidents in the White House, but the focus is very clearly on events in Eastern Europe, and a reminder that COVID hasn't gone away.
Absolutely, Mark. We've had a St Patrick's Day here in Washington very much overshadowed by what has been happening in Ukraine and very much disrupted by COVID, not least, of course, because one of the central players in the festivities, the Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, tested positive for COVID and has been forced into self-isolation. In fact, just a few streets away from the White House, where he's been forced to take part in the ceremonies today via Zoom. So it's far from ideal for him. But nonetheless, he's been very clear about it, been very honest about it, to say, look, let's keep things in perspective. He's been missing out, if you like, on some photocalls in the White House at pretty crucial times, something I know that he was very much looking forward to, but he's pointing to the fact as well that given what is happening elsewhere in the world, not least in Ukraine, he called for a degree of perspective. And I think it was interesting earlier this week, Mark, when we did attend an event marking the life of John Humes, the unveiling of a bust, whenever the Ukrainian ambassador was there for that event, and so too was Micheál Martin. And he dedicated the St Patrick's Day festivities in Washington to the people of Ukraine, given what they were coming to. And we did notice, somebody pointed out at that particular event, the Ukrainian ambassador was almost like a widow at a wake, Mark, because people were queuing up, if you like, to offer her words of comfort over what our country is going through right now. But as the ambassador told us on the day, she says words are one thing, but what the country needs is more practical help to help those people trying to escape, but also as well, she says, to talk about that air zone to be closed off, she says, to try and halt the attacks on her people.
You were following the starry event last night, the Ireland Fund's dinner, and it's the first time in a while, of course, that it's been able to take place properly, and that a president with such Irish connections has been the guest speaker, the guest of honour. But not everyone was entirely happy with the message from the platform last night as far as the President and Speaker Pelosi were concerned.
Yes, most definitely in terms of Nancy Pelosi's speech. It was very much political, very much geared towards talking up the Good Friday Agreement, saying that the administration is very much fully committed to ensuring that everything about the Good Friday Agreement remains in place. And she had some pretty choice words for those in London over Brexit and the fact that she felt that there might be a move to somehow harden the border. She says if there was a move in that direction, then any talk of a UK-US trade deal would simply be off the table. Now, that didn't go down well with one man in particular in the room. Everybody else cheered, but there was one man in the front row, and he certainly was not applauding what Nancy Pelosi had to say, and that, of course, was Gordon Lyons, the Economy Minister. He told us afterwards that he pulled Nancy Pelosi aside, he said, and had a few words about the unionist perspective on the protocol, and he felt it was a good time just to put across their point of view to ensure that there wasn't, I suppose, a one-sided view of the protocol as far as he is concerned. Now, afterwards he told me, and he told me this morning, in fact, that he sensed that perhaps there was a change among US politicians, that perhaps there was more recognition now of some of the problems associated with the protocol. And he says that is a good step because he felt that that might help us move a little bit closer to some kind of resolution.
As you're talking to me there outside the White House in the centre of Washington, you're waiting for the Sinn Féin President, Mary Lou McDonald, to come to join you. I think maybe she's been at a meeting in the White House, or certainly around the White House. She's been very visible, so has Michelle O'Neill, the Vice President. But of course, unionist leaders have not been in Washington this time.
That's right. Doug Beattie, the Ulster Unionist Party, we understand is not well, and we also know for family and personal reasons, Sir Jeffrey Donaldson, the leader of the DUP, is not here. Now, their absence, of course, has been noted because I think the preference is to have all the political leaders from Northern Ireland attend all the events on St Patrick's Day, because it is an opportunity, if you like, to mix with the Irish America and to try and get your point across. And some feel it perhaps was a missed opportunity that there were no unionist leaders here. We did, though, have Gordon Lyons here, and he said he was very much a man on a mission, not just in a ministerial sense, trying to attract inward investors, but very much in a political sense as well, representing his party, making sure that the message was getting across loud and clear about the Northern Ireland Protocol and about the damage it was doing, not just to the economics of Northern Ireland, which he said, but also to its political sustainability.
OK, and listen, we're going to leave it there for now. We hope that Mary Lou McDonald turns up very soon, and we'll come back to you and you can have a chat with her at that point. So for now, thanks very much indeed for joining us. We'll go back to Enda just as soon as we can. But let's move on to the war in Ukraine. It's 3 weeks old, and already the scale of death and destruction is pretty hard to comprehend. Here, we're preparing to receive refugees from the conflict, and we're seeing food and fuel prices soar, of course. The Agriculture Minister, Edwin Poots, is in the eye of the storm. He's concerned about those rising costs to consumers, and he's warned about the potential for shortages and the possibility that some farm businesses could go to the wall. When he appeared before Stormont's Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs Committee yesterday, he also hit out at what he described as the insulting approach of supermarkets in how they're treating their suppliers. We'll hear from Mr Poots in just a moment. But first, here's a flavour of what the producers had to say to MLAs at that meeting.
Compared to a year ago, energy costs have increased by a factor of about 7.
Right now, we're doing our best to try and see, can we even survive? Will we have an industry here to move on with? It's just very frightening.
This isn't something that's going to be solved in 2 or 3 months. This is longer term stuff. And next winter is going to be very expensive.
Mike Johnson and Deirdre McIver speaking yesterday, and the Minister is with me now. Thanks very much indeed for coming in to join us, Edwin Poots. It's pretty clear from the evidence the committee heard yesterday that farmers and agri-food producers are facing real difficulties in the current climate. We heard Mike Johnson saying that next winter is going to be very expensive. How would you sum up the kind of pressures they are facing?
Well, first of all, I'd say whatever pressures, whatever problems, whatever burdens we have, and we have plenty, it is absolutely nothing to what the people of Ukraine are suffering. And therefore, our hearts go out to those people. And we want to be as helpful and supportive to the people of Ukraine as possible here in Northern Ireland. And there's been some fantastic voluntary work done, charitable work. Folks up in Canal there put out a message for goods. They sent 31 articulated trucks out to Poland, and that made its way to Ukraine. And they've also raised well over £100,000, which is going there. So, and that's just one. There's numerous others. But in terms of where we are in food prices and farm gate prices and all of that, we're in a perfect storm in that all of the key commodities that goes into making food have all risen in price dramatically. So everybody knows about the energy costs, how much electricity has went up, how much fuel has went up. But fertiliser has actually went up by 3 times the amount that it was last year. And grain will be about twice as much as it was last year, certainly the year before. And these are the key inputs, the big costs for farms. So there's only 2 options, because the farms can't absorb these additional costs. There's only 2 options. The farms go out of business, our food costs go up. Now, my suspicion is that given this is a worldwide problem, a worldwide crisis, that food prices will go up. Now, we in this part of the world use around 15% of our income on food. And at the same time, mortgages are going up because interest rates are going up. At the same time, energy's going up. So for the Northern Ireland public and for the public right across United Kingdom and beyond, they're going to see their food prices, energy prices and mortgage all going up at the same time, which is going to put a real pressure on families.
Is it your view that supermarkets could do more to absorb some of those costs?
I think certainly in the initial period, supermarkets do need to be absorbing more of the costs. They need to act very quickly. For example, for the pork sector, it has came through a very difficult period for around a year now. All of a sudden, prices have went up quite dramatically for them in terms of the feed costs. That is their single biggest bill, and they have no capacity whatsoever to absorb that. So we really do need to see a very sharp rise in pork prices very quickly. And if they don't get that rise, I have absolutely no doubt those farms will go out of business. So supermarkets do need to respond to that. They can't wait about. They need to ensure that the farms can get a reasonable price for the products they supply.
Well, I think you described the small increases in what the supermarkets are prepared to pay producers who are facing those big input cost rises that you've already talked about as an insult yesterday. Is that fair?
Well, if you're talking about single-digit rises, and I've just talked about 300% and 200%, I'm sorry, it isn't fair. So we need to ensure that what is offered to the primary producer reflects what they're having to put into it.
So we heard yesterday, I think, at the committee about input costs for vegetable producers going up 50 to 70%, and yet supermarkets are only offering a 10% increase on the price they'd been paying. Now, presumably the supermarkets' argument is they need to keep the price to consumers as low as possible, so they can't afford, if they're going to do that, to pay more to those producers. But maybe there needs to be a bit of pain on the part of the supermarkets and on the part of the producers.
Well, some of these supermarkets are turning profits of around £1 billion a year. Now, I think if you go to the farms, you'll find their capacity to absorb the costs is very, very limited. So there's a much greater capacity for the multinationals to absorb a greater proportion of the costs, therefore that they ease that burden for consumers.
How do you get that? How do you deliver that? How do you get the supermarkets to shoulder more of the pain?
Well, I think, and I know that we have been meeting with UK government as well, and they're applying pressure onto them at this stage. The problem is these people go out of business and the supermarkets won't have their suppliers. Then they have to go to other parts of the world and look for supply. That'll come from places where they may be supplying parts of the world who need it more than us, maybe parts of Africa. And then that causes a distortion in that particular market. Because again, the problems that we have here, I referenced us spending 15% of our income on food. In places like Egypt, they spend 50% of what they have on food. Now, if grain prices have doubled, and that is their biggest import, well, then one can recognise the impact that's going to have on a population of 120 million people. So we have to think about others as well as ourselves in this circumstance, and ensuring that there is food to feed the world population, because Ukraine, who could feed 600 million people, and all of the fertiliser that was coming out of Russia, we are going to have a big downturn in the amount of grain that's available. And grain feeds us our bread, our pizzas, our pork products, our dairy products, our chicken products, our beer. So people will find that all of those costs will go up quite dramatically.
You warned yesterday about producers potentially facing bankruptcy and farm businesses also potentially going to the wall. Do you really believe that that could happen and could happen quite soon?
For those whose cash flow is challenged at this moment in time, if they don't get some latitude from their banks, for example, then that's very, very likely. Some of those people have been coming out of difficult periods already. So I mentioned the pork industry, and they really do not have any fat there to handle this particular situation. So the uplifts that they need are immediate and quite significant.
The difficulty, of course, is that you asked for £70 million in support yesterday. Realistically, how do you expect that money to be released from the executive when there isn't a First Minister in place, there isn't a Deputy First Minister in place, and there's no functioning executive? I mean, it's fine in theory to say I need £70 million, and we know there's £300 million sitting there at the moment that's available to try and deal with these spiralling costs. But there isn't a mechanism in place to actually spend the money.
Well, there's unspent money from this year, so we actually don't need a budget to do that. A right around from Conor Murphy would allow that to be distributed, but we haven't had that right around yet. So the requests are in, and it's for Minister Murphy to respond to that. In terms
He was pretty clear when I spoke to him on Sunday Politics last week that his hands are tied on this. He can only make money available if specific executive decisions have been taken about the spending of that money.
In terms of this year's budget, flexibility remains for the Department of Finance. In terms of the monitoring round and all of that there that they have previously done, that can quite easily happen. In terms
You're not embarrassed, though, that the reason we need to look for a workaround is because your party has withdrawn the First Minister, which seemed like a good idea, maybe as far as your perspective was concerned a number of weeks ago. But at this stage, given the international and domestic climate we're in, it's a bit of a nightmare, and it's a nightmare of the DUP's making.
Well, the cost of living nightmare is not of the DUP's making. I think that's more to do with Vladimir Putin.
Well, the nightmare about not being able to deal with the situation is of your party's making.
In terms of the response to it, Conor Murphy doesn't have 300 million extra to spend. Let's be very clear about that. That 300 million has been put out there, and that is money that he hasn't yet allocated. But he hasn't given the Department of Education, for example, enough money to carry out the programmes that it's currently committed to. He hasn't given enough money to the Department of Justice to the point that they'll have to pay off police officers if it proceeds in its current form. He hasn't given enough money to the Department for Economy and Invest Northern Ireland in particular. So there's department after department who have a claim on that money already. So the 300 million is a mythical figure produced by Sinn Féin and has been sucked up by many in the media, I'd have to say, in terms of following it through.
Those ministers, including yourself, are all at your desks trying to work your way through it. But the First Minister's not at his desk. And the reason the First Minister's not at his desk is because your party leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, withdrew him from that position. And that is why we are facing the stasis we are facing at the moment as far as good government in Northern Ireland is concerned. It's entirely your party's responsibility. And all the other parties are agreed on that.
Well, the situation is that for a number of months before that, before the First Minister was withdrawn, that was very well trailed that it was going to happen. We needed movement, we needed action on the protocol. It still hasn't happened.
But it only happened because you wanted it to happen and said that it had to happen. Everybody else didn't agree it had to happen.
Well, in terms of where we came from and the arguments that we were making, you need consensus. You need cross-community support to make these controversial decisions. But this decision has been imposed upon us. And now we have a circumstance where there has been a border created between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Yeah. And we hear the Americans...
But there are other ways of dealing with that. When you talk about consensus and cross-community support, you don't get that by pulling ministers out of government.
Well, we hear Nancy Pelosi saying how we cannot have a border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. I actually agree with her. I don't want a border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. But we don't need to have a border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. So a lot
of people would agree with you, but the way you deal with that is you allow the British government to continue its negotiations with the European Commission to try to come up with a better solution, which both sides say they want and are working towards. You do not create chaos in Northern Ireland by pulling the First Minister out and paralysing government. That's what the DUP did, for purely tactical reasons.
Well, it is for tactical reasons.
Well, there you go.
And it is to drive a message through to the European Union. You are driving a coach and horses through the Good Friday Agreement.
Do you think that the European Union is quaking in its boots because of the move made by the DUP to a greater extent than people here in Northern Ireland are frustrated at the way in which government has been paralysed by a strategic decision, a tactical decision, as you've just admitted yourself, taken by your party 50 days now, as it is, away from an Assembly election?
Funny enough, the European Union was always great to stand up and claim to have an awful lot to do with the Belfast Agreement.
What about the DUP's responsibility? That's what I'm interested in asking you about.
But now when they're driving a coach and horses through the Belfast Agreement, all of a sudden it won't matter. Well, it does matter.
Yeah. So you think it was the right thing to do? You think Sir Geoffrey was right to withdraw Paul Givan from the First Minister's position? You think that's actually helped the situation in Northern Ireland, helped us deal with rising fuel costs, helped us deal with food poverty, helped us deal with the Ukrainian crisis? You think that's a good move, a smart move, do you?
Well, let's be very clear. Whenever we were making that decision, Vladimir Putin hadn't invaded Ukraine. We are driving a message home to the European Union. You cannot have the political element of the peace process in place and have the Northern Ireland Protocol as it currently exists. So you need to get round the table and sort that out. The sooner they sort it out, the sooner we can sort all of the rest of the issues out.
OK, well, it's very interesting that you should take that line in this conversation tonight, because it does seem, if we're to believe what you're saying at the moment, that the DUP's positioning will mean there'll be no executive for quite a while after May. And indeed, your party leader said in Crossgar last Friday, the only leverage we have is our participation in those institutions. That's the reality. If we continue to do business as usual, we'll be taken for granted. And then he said, I'm very clear, I'll not be going back into the executive until this matter is dealt with. So that ties in with what you're saying now. But then, Minister, just watch this. You said this to the committee at the end of yesterday's session at the Assembly.
Come May, that we won't have too long to wait to get an executive operating, that we can get this protocol Brexit stuff out of our hair and actually get on with doing good things in Northern Ireland, which the people want us to do. I think that's ultimately where everybody wants to be. So the sooner we can find some common ground on that particular front.
So there was a more relaxed approach by you yesterday at the end of that committee meeting, where you talked about getting this protocol Brexit stuff out of our hair so we can get on with doing good for Northern Ireland. It didn't look like you were worried about an existential threat to the Union in those comments, in the way that maybe you did sitting there across from me just a few moments ago. Which is it?
Well, I think they're both the same.
They didn't look and sound the same.
Well, getting the protocol issues out of our hair and moving on is what we want to do. We want to get Stormont up and running as quickly as possible. So I don't want this to be delayed for months. We need actions in this, and we need the European Union to step up to the plate and come to some reasonable and sensible compromises with Her Majesty's government that takes the border out of the Irish Sea.
Yeah,
that's the bottom line on this.
There was a whiff of optimism about the way you were handling yourself yesterday, and maybe not quite so much tonight in this forum.
I'm still hopeful that common sense will prevail, because what is the point? What good does it do the European Union that seed potatoes can't be brought in here? Ordinary plants, seeds that people are putting in for their tulips in their gardens at this time of the year can't be brought from Great Britain. Potato seed in Scotland can't be brought here.
Well, with the greatest respect,
they want to check.
Being able to get hold of tulip bulbs at the moment is hardly people's greatest priority.
They want to check the bags in your cars coming over on the ferries from Scotland. It is ridiculous what has been asked of us by the Northern Ireland Protocol. It needs to be dealt with, and it needs to be dealt with urgently. OK,
can I just ask you about the decision by P&O Ferries to sack 800 staff today? Your colleague, the Economy Minister, said the ships won't operate from Larne for another week. We've already talked about difficulty with supply lines and food shortages potentially in Northern Ireland later in the year. What kind of disruption do you think that P&O decision is likely to have on supplies into Northern Ireland?
Well, it puts massive pressure on the other ferry operators. The ferry operations are all running pretty near full. Over the course, since the protocol, actually, we have got around 20% more trade going through the ports on southern lorries, which are seeking to avoid the ports in Dublin because there's less checks here. So there isn't the capacity there. So there's a consequence for that. There's goods that would be coming into Northern Ireland which won't be able to get in. There's export materials that needs to get out of Northern Ireland which won't get out. About 50% of our food is exported to Great Britain. So that is a real problem for us.
And are you shocked at the way P&O as a company handled that decision, that announcement today? Just summary dismissal, redundancy notices for 800 members of staff?
I think everything, the way that P&O have went about this and what they're proposing to do, everything about it is absolutely disgraceful. And I think as a company, P&O has done themselves huge damage. And ethically, you know, the plan to bring in people from other countries and work at less than minimum wage is just something which is, it really isn't acceptable.
One last question. This is just broken while we were having our conversation. Your party colleague, Paula Bradley, the deputy leader of the DUP, has announced that she is stepping away from politics to look after elderly parents. She's standing down as an MLA. Does that surprise you?
I've been chatting to Paula for about a month about this, and I'm disappointed that she's stepping down, but I understand it. And Paula is a lovely, gracious lady, and she's putting the needs of her mother in particular first. And as someone who is, you know, very supportive of everybody who engages in family things, I can only support Paula in her decision, but hugely disappointed that we're losing one of our shining lights.
but a loss to the party at the Assembly?
A loss to the party, a loss to North Belfast, and a loss to the Assembly. Paula brought an awful lot of common sense to the table. OK. Edwin Poots, really appreciate you coming in to talk to me tonight. Thank you very much indeed. There'll be more on that announcement from Paula Bradley on Good Morning Ulster tomorrow morning. But let's return to Enda McClafferty in Washington, where he is now joined by the Sinn Féin President, Mary Lou McDonald. Enda.
Yes, that's right. Mary Lou McDonald has now stepped out of that ceremony which was taking place in the White House to share thoughts with us about today and indeed about some of the conversations that you have been having, because unlike the Taoiseach, you did get some time today to talk to President Biden. What was your sense about his feelings now towards where things are at politically in Northern Ireland?
Well, I think the President and the administration as a whole, and indeed political leaders across the aisle in the United States, have been absolutely consistent, absolutely explicit in their support for the Good Friday Agreement, in their insistence that the Good Friday Agreement can't be damaged by Brexit, in their insistence that any issues around the protocol need to get ironed out and sorted out, and on their insistence that democracy must flourish, that we have our elections and that we roll up our sleeves and get on with the business. So this is a very positive number of days for Ireland, North and South, and the support coming from the Biden administration is rock solid.
Do you get a sense at all that US politicians now are perhaps starting to see that there are problems with the protocol? Because that's what Minister Gordon Lyons is picking up during his time here, that before this it was a case of just get on with it, but now there's a sense he feels that there's at last some acknowledgement here that the protocol needs to be fixed.
Look, I mean, from the get-go, just remember Brexit. The Brexit negotiations were dragged out to the 11th hour because of the stance of the British government. The protocol itself is complex, and there was always provision made for a joint committee to iron out challenges or problems that might arise. So that's never been in dispute. That joint committee needs to be used. The European side, under the leadership of Šefčovič, have been, in our view, very constructive, very energetic, and solutions can be found to the issues that arise. And people across the board, right across the island, want the protocol to work. Business needs to get to business. People need jobs. We need to move on. Certainly what nobody wants is the kind of disruption that the DUP has brought.
But of course your party did call for the full implementation of the protocol initially. You wanted fully implemented, and here we are many months on and we see all the problems with it. Did you get it wrong back then?
No, and I mean, and the fact is that we said from the get-go that Brexit was going to be hugely problematic, that it was going to cause a serious challenge, not least to the all-island economy. And we were very clear that there cannot be a hardening of the border on the island of Ireland. And that has not happened, and that will not happen. And the protocol, whatever the finessing that needs to happen, let that happen. But we still need the protections that are contained within it. And it's not going anywhere. And, you know, any pretense from anyone for electoral purposes that they're going to dispense with the protocol, that's not the stuff of the real world.
You are here, of course, with Michelle O'Neill, the former Deputy First Minister. Does anybody here in America realise that we do not have a fully functioning executive?
Everyone
really?
in America, yes, everybody here involved in political life knows that the DUP have walked away, that the executive cannot function out, but they know something else, that we have elections on the 5th of May, and that whatever the outcome of that election has to be respected by everybody, and then we need to get back to work. And the rule book that is the Good Friday Agreement needs to be respected and applied by all of us.
You say that, of course, but we do have two executive ministers here, and on the surface it looks as if it's business as usual for them. They're going around having their meetings, trying to attract inward investment. So the people on the outside looking in, they'll say, well, you know, seems
no, nobody sees it like that. I mean, people here are very, very well informed and follow things very, very carefully. Just remember, the Good Friday Agreement now will turn its 24th year. Next year will mark a quarter of a century of diplomatic and political investment by everybody concerned, but not least by successive administrations here in the United States. And anybody who imagines, who is foolish enough to imagine that any system would allow all of that effort to be washed down the shore, again, does not live in the real world.
Let's not forget, of course, you also walked away from government. You also walked away from the executive. You will say the circumstances were very different back then, but the end result was the same. We didn't have an executive for 3 years.
Here's the core difference. We have always abided by and respected agreements that we have struck.
Yeah,
and
but
we
you
have
left Northern Ireland without an executive for 3 years.
And we have had an ongoing problem to this day with a failure to honour agreements by political unionism and by the British government. I wish it were not so,
yes,
my friend,
and the people,
but unfortunately
the people
that's
in Northern
what
Ireland paid the price without a government for 3 years.
Look, whatever about the past, in the here and now, in the midst of a cost of living crisis, at a time when people are to the pin of their collar, I am very confident that people right across the community want politics to work. They want agreements once struck to be delivered. I think that's only reasonable. And they want active ministers, an active executive and assembly.
£300 million sitting there right now. It can't be accessed to Conor Murphy, and this is to help people with their rising energy bills. The SDLP has come up with a plan now to try and make this happen. Is your party going to support it?
Look, we want that money dispensed, and we put it to Jeffrey Donaldson very clearly that the simple and fail-safe way to make that happen is for nominations to be made, the executive to meet even on an extraordinary basis and disperse those monies. That's the legally sound.
If it doesn't happen.
Well, that should happen, and that's the legally sound way to go about our business. And by the way, Conor Murphy took advice from the Attorney General, explored all avenues, and our strong advice is that the safe legal way to disperse this much needed money to hard-pressed families is for the executive to meet
we know the
and to get
preferred
the money
option, but in the absence of that, people will want to know, is there a contingency plan? Is there another way we can go with this?
Well, look, our legal advice is that it requires a meeting of the executive, and I'm not sure there's a way around that. I know that others have come forward with a motion or a plan, and of course we will look at every available option, but just to stress, the legal advice from the Attorney General, from the highest legal office, is that the executive should meet and look at what is the sense at a time when people are struggling and when we all agree that we want to get money into people's pockets. Why would the DUP block an emergency meeting to make sure that that happens?
OK, that's a question for them, obviously.
Yes.
Mary Lou McDonald, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for talking to us on the programme. And there you have it, Marcus. Back to you in the studio.
And thanks very much indeed, our political editor, Enda McLafferty, live outside the White House in Washington for us. Finally tonight, over 3 million people have now fled war-torn Ukraine, according to the United Nations. The government's Homes for Ukraine will see people in the UK hosting refugees in their homes for a minimum of 6 months. More than 100,000 people are volunteering to take part in the scheme, but there are concerns about how much support will actually be available for those arriving seeking sanctuary. Tonight, we have confirmation from the Secretary of State, Brandon Lewis, that 6,262 people here have expressed an interest in the scheme. Let's talk to Sinead Marmion, who's a human rights lawyer at Phoenix Law in Belfast. Welcome to the programme. Do you think, first of all, that the scheme, as you understand it, is fit for purpose?
At present, on first blush, it is a good idea, but when you dig a little deeper, I don't think it is fit for purpose. For example, there's no safeguarding checks on either sponsoring party or person that's entering the country. We have no idea how the scheme will be monitored for the 6 months, and there are no safeguards for potential traumatised people arriving, both in terms of potential healthcare available when they arrive and also for the sponsors as well.
So it's a good idea in theory. You're just concerned that the government is rushing through a scheme without the checks and balances that perhaps need to be in place. Now, the government says it's an unlimited scheme. There is no cap on the number of Ukrainians who could come into the United Kingdom seeking sanctuary. And that means that the potential for checking is enormous. But we've got no information at all about that as yet.
Exactly, and that's the major concern that's shared amongst colleagues in the profession and also the third sector as well, and community groups. The government says that they may do checks, but there's nothing to say whether someone will check whether someone's on a violent offenders register, whether there's access NI checks, whether there's going to be, checks on the sexual offenders register, for example. So we have no idea at this stage, and the scheme does go live tomorrow.
So yeah, people can begin to actually make connections with potential Ukrainians who might want to come and live in their homes from tomorrow. I mean, would there not be a way of fast-tracking applications from those people here who have already been checked through existing criminal record schemes like Access NI. Does that not make sense? That at the very least you would want to do is say, well, we have a number of people who've already been through a checking process. Let's give them priority.
That would make sense. That's not apparent as yet. And also, an initial check is fine, but how do you monitor that going forward for the 6 months? In my work, I see trauma coming out, as someone settles down into the community. Often when someone arrives, they're just looking forward to getting somewhere safe to sleep. But as time goes on, it becomes apparent that, those people need help, need services. And that, again, that's not apparent. And, that's an awful burden. It's a dereliction of duty from the government to put on individual people.
So the benign concern that you have is that some individuals who may offer sanctuary in their home are just simply hopelessly ill-equipped to offer the kind of support that traumatised people fleeing a war zone might need. That's a big enough concern. But then the even greater concern is that there could be individuals in the UK, specifically here in Northern Ireland, who could be seeking to exploit vulnerable people coming here.
That's a huge concern. We've seen the numbers rising for those who are victims of trafficking in Northern Ireland. We already have our existing refugee population is already under stress, and the majority of those people will have gone through exploitation themselves. So it's definitely a major concern, especially when it's an unlimited scheme. You essentially select your refugee that you want to come into your home on an unmonitored system. So it's, in my view, ripe for exploitation.
How does this scheme, as we understand it, in your view, compare to previous schemes put in place for people who came here from places like Afghanistan and Syria?
Those are two very different schemes. There was a lot of funding put in and around the Syrian scheme, and set numbers and systems were put in place. The Afghan scheme I haven't seen happen at all. There's nearly, there's also like a dereliction of duty on behalf of the government in that scheme as well, because
there are actually large numbers of Afghan nationals simply living in hotels in Northern Ireland. Exactly.
But then, we've got family members that are still behind, that they can't arrive. There's no method of them actually seeking entry into the UK in a lawful way. And that's something that the government has abdicated their duty on as well in terms of the Afghan scheme. It's all outsourced out of country. And again, there's people here who are without their family members and can't get them here.
Does that give you cause for concern that if the two schemes for Afghan and Syrian refugees have been far from perfect and have not worked as well as they perhaps ought to have done, and people hoped they might have done, that lessons have not been learned?
Well, I wouldn't want to criticise the Syrian scheme, because there's a lot of local community groups and social workers and people that have really gone above and beyond in that scheme to make people feel welcome. But what I would say is that in the round, the government really could have done more and could do better in relation to this scheme and the Afghan scheme.
In a sentence or two, if you could, if you were asked to give advice to the government, what would you say the number one priority has to be?
Engage with community groups, engage with lawyers, and services need to be funded, especially healthcare services, education for the children that will be arriving, and also, most importantly, helping those who are traumatised.
OK, Sinead Marmion, very good to hear your thoughts. Thanks very much indeed for coming in to share those experiences with us. Just before we go, a quick reminder about our Red Lines podcast. Over the next 6 weeks, we'll be profiling all 18 constituencies ahead of the election, which is just 50 days away. Up first, it's Lagan Valley, Upper Bann and Newry and Armagh. That conversation is available now on BBC Sounds or wherever you get your podcasts. And that's it for tonight. I'll be back with Sunday Politics at the usual time of 10 o'clock on BBC One. And how else could we leave you this St Patrick's night other than with this celebratory comedy gold courtesy of the Muppets? From all of us, night-night.
Oh, Danny boy, oh, Danny boy, oh, Danny boy, oh, Danny boy, oh, boy, oh, boy. Oh, Danny.